Hi, everybody. I want to discuss something that's sort of at the intersection between last week's portion of Tisa and this upcoming portion of Vayakhel, which we're going to read together with the portion of Pekude. We get so wrapped up in the golden calf because it's like this nightmare unfolding in the midst of our honeymoon of revelation with, revelation from Hashem at Sinai, and then it's interrupted with this horrible event. It's so gripping that I think the rest of the story a lot of times gets, kind of lost in the shuffle. Because around the story of the golden calf, there are two bookends that are essentially the same subject. In Tisa, we have these two stories unfolding parallel. Moshe is up on the mountain with Hashem for 40 days. On the last day, we have the golden calf unfolding, but there's this final kind of conversation between Moshe and Hashem. And we know that there's no prophecy that ever came close to this kind of prophecy that Moshe is having, where, someone spoke to Hashem like directly in that kind of way. And now right before Moshe goes back from this revelation to the earthly reality, Hashem tells him about building the tabernacle, and there's one kind of last message. Now, what would you guess that last message would be? Maybe a blessing, leadership advice? But no. Hashem tells Moshe about Shabbat. Well, that's weird. We've heard about Shabbat so many times already. We heard about Shabbat in Genesis and Bereshit when the world was created. Then we hear about it in the manna when Hashem says, don't take don't take manna on Shabbat. You have to take extra on Friday, and I'll give you, enough that'll last you for Shabbat. Then we see it again in the 10 Commandments. And, there are two versions of 10 Commandments in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. And, in one version we hear Shamor, in one version we hear Zachor. The sages teach us that these words, Zachor to commemorate the Shabbat, and Shamor to guard the Shabbat, were spoken by Hashem at the same time. A lot of people understand that as symbolizing the positive and the negative commandments, the things that you must do on Shabbat and the things that you mustn't do on Shabbat. So we get all of that in the 10 Commandments. Then we hear about Shabbat again in the Torah portion of Mishpatim, where we hear about the social kind of perspective, where you have to let your servants rest and your animals rest. So it seems like we've just come at this from every possible angle. Why is Hashem bringing up Shabbat again? And why is that the very last thing that Moshe needs to hear in his revelation? Let's look together at the verses. In verse 12, it says, "And you speak to the children of Israel and say, only keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you for your generations to know that I, the Lord, make you holy. Therefore keep the Shabbat, for it is a sacred thing for you. Those who desecrate it shall be put to death, for whoever performs work on it, that soul will be cut off from the midst of its people." And it doesn't stop there, it keeps on going. It says 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day it is a day of Shabbat, of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever performs work on the Shabbat day shall be put to death. Thus shall the children of Israel observe the Shabbat, to make the Shabbat throughout their generations as an everlasting covenant between me and the children of Israel. It is forever a sign that in 6 days the Lord created the heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he ceased and rested. What are we seeing here? What is being added? It's a good question, right? And then again, you would think that was enough. After the sin of the calf and right before commanding the people about the tabernacle, Moshe goes back into it. This coming Parsha of Vayakhel starts with Moshe again telling the people about Shabbat. The Torah could have just said, well, Moshe spoke to the people all that Hashem commanded, but then Moshe tells them about this again. It's really marvelous. Why are these two stories of Shabbat being told again? And why are they being told right after the revelation? They're interrupted by the golden calf, but it would seem that had it not been for the golden calf, the sort of development of the story would have been that Moshe finishes the revelation 40 days up at Sinai, and then Hashem talks to him about Shabbat, and then he conveys that to the people. It's interrupted by the calf story, but it seems like Shabbat here is actually meant to be the main conversation that follows revelation. So here are the questions. What is different here? What are we getting new? Why do we need to hear more about Shabbat? And why is this the message that we need now? So I want to look more closely at those verses I just read, because there are a few new concepts that we meet here that we haven't met before. Up until now, Shabbat was a commandment, and it was a commemoration of God's creation and God resting. And so, if God rested, we rest, we have to let our servants rest. But here we meet for the first time that the Shabbat is holy. It says in verse 13, keep the Shabbat, for I am the Lord who makes you holy. And if you desecrate the Shabbat, you will be punished. Meaning The term desecrate obviously can only be used regarding something that's holy because you're making something unholy. That's what desecrating means. So you can't desecrate something that's not, right? That's not holy to begin with. So that's interesting. For you and I, we kind of take that as a given. That's obvious. Of course, Shabbat is a holy day. But put yourself in the shoes of the Israelites up until now. They've just been told what to do on Shabbat. No one ever told them that it's holy. Don't work, rest, don't take manna, don't let your servants work. What's holy about that? It's just stuff that you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. It's like we keep kosher, but it doesn't mean that everything we eat is specifically holy, right? There's just like the priests eat holy food, but right, we could just eat regular food as long as we're keeping it kosher, right? There are many commandments like that. If you wear clothing that doesn't have, mixtures of wool and linen, you're following a mitzvah. But it doesn't mean that the clothes that you're wearing are of any kind of specific holiness. You're just not breaking the rules. So here we have this idea of holiness appearing for the first time. Then the verses keep going and we meet a new verb regarding Shabbat that we haven't seen before either. It says in verse 16, thus shall the children of Israel observe the Shabbat to make the Shabbat. La'asot et ha-Shabbat in Hebrew. Throughout their generations is an everlasting covenant. Make the Shabbat is a new term. As I said before, we've seen Zachor, which is to remember the Shabbat, and we've seen Shamor, which is to guard the Shabbat. What does it even mean to make the Shabbat? In Hebrew, the word is la'asot. It's like to do something, to make something. How do you make Shabbat? Isn't Shabbat just a fact? It's just a day. I don't make a day. How do I make a day? The day just exists. And the third term that we meet here for the first time is the Shabbat is a covenant. There are 613 commandments in the Torah. Not so many of them are covenants. We have circumcision. I can't really think of any other commandments besides for that are covenants. There's Shabbat here. And up until now, we would have just thought that Shabbat is a commandment. We didn't know that that was some kind of special covenant, some sort of covenantal relationship that we have with Hashem through this commandment. So now when we look at it and put it all together, what's new here? We have a whole new perspective on Shabbat that's being given over that wasn't given before. We have holiness. That's Hashem's job. Hashem plants that there. Hashem plants holiness. It's like a spark of potential buried in the fabric of time itself. And then there's the la'asot, to make, to do. That's the verb of what we're supposed to do, to make Shabbat. And in the meeting place of the potential that Hashem plants and something that we're supposed to do, that meeting place creates covenant. Now, I know I've spoken about this before, but it just reminds me, and so I want to mention again, there are 3 types of water sources in Israel. There's the spring, the well, and the cistern. In the land of Israel, you have springs. You don't do anything. You're just walking in the desert, and they pop up. We went out with Yossi, our partner, to the desert on Friday, and he just took us through the desert, up and down the mountains, and we're driving through, and he turns left at some ditch, and then, there was a spring right there. And then you have cisterns. Cisterns are something that people dig. They're holes that people dig in the ground to collect rainwater. It's just, that's all you, right? But it's interesting that all the marriages, the big famous marriages in Genesis, and all what the patriarchs are doing is all around wells, right? We hear so much about wells. Why is a well important? Because a well is interesting. It's like a combination of those two things. There's the effort that you put into digging the well, but unlike a cistern, the well is not going to work unless Hashem planted water there to begin with. That's why wells are so special, because it's the meeting place between our effort and the potential that Hashem put there. And that's like what we have on Shabbat. Hashem plants holiness in the day, but you don't tap into the holiness unless you dig. You have to make Shabbat, to do Shabbat. And Hashem uses this verb here that's different than the verb he uses regarding keeping the commandments. There's some sort of digging into the inherent holiness of the day that's something beyond keeping the laws, because Hashem used a different word to talk about keeping the laws. It's something you make of Shabbat that's a meeting between the holiness and something that you do. It hits the spot and creates an everlasting covenant that's beyond keeping the laws. So I'm scratching my head. What does that mean? How do we make Shabbat? Well, there's another place in the Bible that we see these words, again, of la'asot, to make, in the context of Shabbat, alongside the word Kodesh, holy. But it's in an opposite meaning. If you look in Isaiah 58:13, it says, Im tashiv mishabat raglecha, asot chafatzecha biyom kodshi. It says, if you restrain your foot because of the Sabbath from performing your affairs on my holy day, you call the Shabbat a delight. The holy of the Lord honored, and you honor it by not doing your wanted ways, by not pursuing your affairs and speaking words. So here we have this combination again of what we do. It says la'asot, right? la'asot chafatzecha, to do the things that you would normally do. And you're not supposed to do those things on Hashem's holy day. So as Isaiah is telling us what not to do, not to perform your normal affairs on Shabbat because it's a holy day. Don't pursue your normal activities. Don't speak your normal words, he tells us. So by the inverse, we can understand what you do on Shabbat. You do Shabbat, you make Shabbat by doing the opposite of your normal affairs. This is really important because you can technically keep Shabbat and not really experience Shabbat at all. You can surely make sure not to turn on electricity, not to carry things outside, not to light a fire, but you could just be talking about the ball game, have a timer that switches on your TV to watch the news. You can keep every law in the book and you didn't even touch the covenant side of Shabbat that Hashem is talking about here. Now, it's also really important because a lot of people say, well, wait, what is Shabbat for me if I'm not Jewish, for example? Maybe I'm not required to keep all of the details of the laws and not turn on the lights and not carry, so do I not have Shabbat? Hashem is giving here a whole other perspective, a whole other aspect about Shabbat beyond the guarding of Shabbat, of guarding the laws. He says there's a whole other element. That's the covenantal element, something else. That's the meeting between the inherent holiness that Hashem hid in time and can go completely undetected if you don't dig that well. And that means setting aside Shabbat and making Shabbat. You make it la'asot Shabbat, to make Shabbat by not doing what you would normally do and focusing on the Spirit, focusing on holiness, on Torah, not your normal activities. And that is what Hashem calls an everlasting covenant. And that can look different for different people, but you know it. You know it when you feel it. It's like you have to experience it to know that you've gotten there. And, it's sometimes a struggle for me, like on Shabbat. Of course, we keep Shabbat, we keep the rules, but as a mom, there are lots of things that just feel like, day-to-day stuff that keep on ticking. I have to feed the kids, so instead of, making new food, I feed them the food I made yesterday, but it's not like always totally different. I can sometimes keep the laws and just not really feel like I'm in the Shabbat spirit, right? And so, if I'm reading a book all week long, I can keep on reading that book on Shabbat. There's no rule against it, nothing technically preventing me from doing that. I can chat about my work and talk about the news. But then when I realized this reading that there's this whole new aspect of Shabbat, it really changed my past Shabbat yesterday. And, every moment of the day, I kept thinking, how can I not do normal and do something special? So for me, that really for everybody it could be something different. But for me, that inspired me. I invited the families of the farm over after prayers. I said, okay, I'll provide the food, but I want everybody to come and share a Torah idea. And we all sat together and every person was just sharing a different, idea that spoke to them from the Torah portion. And in the afternoon, that meant learning Torah rather than just reading the newspaper. And, so for every person that can be different, but there's something beyond guarding the Shabbat and turning it into a covenant that I think is the special message of this portion. But then the question is, why is that so important? Specifically now, as the last thing that Hashem says to Moshe in sort of the return to normal life after Revelation. And this I learned from Rabbi Foreman this week. The revelation is when we heard Hashem speaking to us directly. And then Moshe unbelievably goes up to Sinai. And it's this moment in history that will probably, that can really never be recreated. It's like this actual meeting with Hashem, but it's our job to recreate it to the best of our ability and to maintain the memory of that. So, Rabbi Foreman says that the revelation was this transcendence beyond space and time. Moshe went up for 40 days. It says he didn't eat or drink, meaning he transcended time. He didn't feel time passing in the way that we think about it. And he went up into the cloud. What is the cloud? The cloud is symbolic of Hashem's presence. So it's like he went past physical space into Hashem's space, as it were. And so we can't do that, simultaneously. We can't always have revelation where we transcend space and time, but maybe we can do those things separately. We can have space that transcends space. That's the tabernacle. It's like a space that's in this world, but we are able to connect from there to Hashem's space. And then we have a space in time where we're able to transcend regular time and connect with Hashem beyond time. And that, it doesn't say about the tabernacle or the temple that they're an everlasting covenant because they can be destroyed. They're physical, but Shabbat can never be destroyed. And that's why it's an everlasting covenant, because it recreates the covenant, the revelation that we had with Hashem at Sinai, that relationship that was forged. We maintain it by this space that we create in time on Shabbat. And it's like, it's like at the end of the revelation and going back into normal life, as it were, Hashem is like comforting Moshe and comforting the people and saying, yes, we had this revelation, and yes, we're going back into regular life, but it's not the end, because I'm creating for you. I'm planting a little bit of this revelation every week in Shabbat so you can tap into it. You'll have it forever. This is an everlasting covenant, because as long as there is time, there will always be the ability to have our Sinai moment with Hashem in this time that's so special and transcendent, but it depends on us making it. So I hope that lights up your Shabbats the way it lit up my Shabbat. And with that, I wish everybody a beautiful week. Bye, guys.